Okay, let's start. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this ICTCT webinar. My name is Stijn Daniels, and on behalf of the steering committee of ICTCT, I will be your host today. A special welcome to our speaker of the day, Claes Tingvall, who is joining us from Sweden. And before we start with the webinar, a couple of things that we would like to tell you on behalf of ICTCT. ICTCT stands for the International Collaboration on Theories and Concepts in Traffic Safety. It's an organization, an association that is around since 1988, quite a long time. By the way, we are very happy to see among us today Kister Hudeen, who is in fact one of the founding members and the first president of ICTCT, actually living in Norway, but very glad that he is still joining the ICTCT events, which is one of the rare advantages of this whole Corona situation. But let's consider this as a great advantage. So welcome, Kister, welcome everyone. We will be around 70, and for the ones who already joined one or another webinar in the past, this is the first time that we will have the system in which we can see each other during the presentation and mainly also during the questions and answers, so that it's hopefully nice that many people can see each other again, sometimes after a long while. Okay, if you want, we won't tell a lot about ICTCT, but please visit our website and register there to stay updated about our activities. Before we start, just two short announcements. One is the next annual conference of ICTCT that will be held at the end of October next year in Győr in Hungary, and will be hosted by Professor Attila Borsos from the university there. Győr is a nice city, not too far from Vienna and Budapest, so well doable to go there, and certainly worth the visit, not just for the conference. So keep the date in mind, and the call for abstracts will appear in spring next year. Then we are already glad to announce the next webinar that will be held on February 25th, the same day, Friday, and also the same time. And that time it will be done by Professor David Shinar from the Ben Gurion University in Israel. David Shinar, who wrote an excellent book about human factors and safety, so certainly worth the effort to listen to him as well. Good. Saying this, I want to move on to the webinar itself. The guest of today is Claes Tingvall, who is the former director of the Swedish, or the Road Safety Division of the Swedish Transport Administration. He is also assistant professor at Chalmers University in Sweden and also at Monash University in Australia. He obtained doctoral degrees at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden and Emory University in Atlanta, USA. He has published on injury epidemiology and safety rating and safety management. And last but not least, certainly for today, he was strongly involved in developing the Vision Zero from the very beginning, the Vision Zero that became quite well known across the world, so to say. And this is exactly the reason why we invited him to be with us today and to explain a bit more about the content of those or this Vision Zero and the system safety that is behind. Before we really start, a few words about the practical organization. So the idea is that we have a lecture of about 40 minutes, that there is room for questions and answers afterwards. If you have questions, you can either ask them directly to Claes after the presentation, or you can already, if you have some questions that are popping up during the presentation, you can already put them in the chat box. And Alexei will help at moderating this session and that even grouping, if necessary, some of the questions and discussing them in a structured way with Claes at the end of the session. Practical remark is that this session, this webinar will be recorded and will be made available at the YouTube channel of ICTCT and also the website of ICTCT after the webinar. So I think that's all for my introduction. So please, Claes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that nice introduction. And great, as you say, to, I mean, there are not only downsides with the pandemic, there are a couple of upsides as well, and this is one of them, to be able and have the honor to present to people from many, many countries of the world without traveling, which would have been very complicated. So at least we learned something that might be useful. I will show a presentation, so I'll start sharing my screen, and let's bear with me so it works. I've already seen that there are a few. Can you see it now? Is it okay?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Alexei. I've already seen a couple of persons, and I've understood that, for example, Christer Hydén is there, and Per Gårder, and Magnus Granström, and a few others I probably know. I didn't have the time to flip through all of you, but I'm sure I've met at least some of you. Of course, it's an honor to talk to people that I've learned so much from, and that's been involved in our business for so many years. I've been involved in it since 1976, so I've got a long history, and I can assure you I've been involved in every mistake that can be done in our field, and that's how I've learned things and what works. And maybe that's been a waste of time sometimes, but on the other hand, I can assure you that I won't forget all the mistakes. In any case, I'll talk about sort of what we have in front of us rather than talking about the history. And what we have in front of us is certainly a game-changing thing. It will change the role of traffic safety, the status of traffic safety, and the way we operate, and the kind of policies we will be operating under. And I'm saying this because I'm pretty sure it will happen, simply because so many are now involved and understand that we are entering a new era and a new decade, not only by the numbers, but also in reality. And that's what I intend to explain to you all, so that you can feel fairly secure in sort of what kind of direction the world is taking and should be taking now in the years to come. Just so we familiarize a little bit, all of us, I'm sure you're so you understand these kind of words and what they mean more than what I do even. As you know, prevention is normally described as either you go downstream, you can go both downstream and somewhere else, but downstream means, of course, that you are sort of doing things very close to the road user by information, regulation, enforcement of the individuals, and also other things as well, training people. That's very much of the past. Some of it still works. Some of it is really important, like legislation. And some of it we've sort of left behind us simply because it didn't help us at all. For example, if you teach children traffic rules, that's something that, of course, we've left many years behind us simply because it's dangerous. No, with sort of time, and of course it happened many years, but going upstream means changing more of the fundamentals of the system rather than sort of changing the use of it. And we do it by changing, of course, sort of rules and things like that, but also our environment, our infrastructure, the kind of vehicles we're using, the way we control things, and now more and more with methods that sort of are based on digitalization and connectivity and things like that. But we sort of understand that the human in the environment and the norms that creates sort of the kind of traffic plays a very big role, and we as professionals can control that very much. I'm not saying we're controlling people, but we know what we can do to change the ways people operate the system and also change the norms of the system. I mean, we all know that sort of people in the road transport system very much act as copycats. It's not that everyone is thinking about everything what you do. It's really the most comfortable way of using the road transport system is simply to copy what others are doing. That's why it's sometimes quite complicated, and that's why things sometimes don't work for us. But that's another story. So it's just the fundamentals, and why I'm saying this is sort of that the next step, if I may call it so, it's not changing everything, but what we add now very much happened, the sort of discussion and the decisions and like the Stockholm Declaration, that was a result of the big conference held in Stockholm, the Ministerial Conference on Traffic Safety, that took place just before the sort of outbreak of the pandemic in Europe, at least, in February last year, February 2020. A major step. It was the third ministerial conference. The first one was in 2009, second 2015. But this one really marks sort of going into a new decade, and understanding that a lot of good things had happened before this conference, at least in the minds of a lot of people, but in reality, the problem is sort of has not really changed so much. The number of fatalities and serious injuries has stayed the same on the sort of over the past decade, which doesn't say that we've failed, but it says we haven't done or didn't understand how to do enough. I had the honor and opportunity, and which was probably although with high age, this was still one of the sort of highlights of my career, and that was working together with a number of experts. 13 was the actual number from across the world and from different disciplines in traffic safety, but working with them in trying to give advice and recommendations to the global road safety work. And very much then was the basis for, as I said, the Stockholm Declaration, and then also the UN resolution that was taken in August 2020 that builds more or less on this expert report together with other things as well. And later has sort of led to what has just been launched, which is the global plan. If you haven't read things like this, I suggest you do that, because there's a lot of good words you can find there. And the expert report really sort of got into a let's say, a journey that was not terribly comfortable, I must say, because it was outside the comfort zone of all of us as sort of researchers or people who knew both bureaucracy and politics and research, but mostly people from I must say, from academia. But going into things we haven't sort of heard very much before, and I'll going to come back to now with that, with a number of examples. But there is a book, and I'll just pick sort of some of the highlights from this book, from the expert group recommendations, which we call them. The most important thing that has happened is the inclusion of road safety in the global goals in the 2030 agenda, or the SDGs, and you can call it some different kinds of things. I'm sure all of you're familiar with this, at least with sort of the way it's presented. But you have to go through it a little bit deeper to understand the fundamentals of it. And first of all, that it has got to do with health, climate, and equity. That's sort of the key words of the 2030 agenda. These are the things that are so fundamental for every citizen, for every country, for the globe, that we need really to cater for these three areas to develop our world and not destroy it completely. Health, climate, and equity goes together all the time. And what sort of follows from that is that the world of trade-offs must be over. These goals in here, they are absolute and they are indivisible. And every one of you that knows something about transport politics can already see here that it's a big change in transport policies, where you weigh benefits to sort of disbenefits, where you see casualties as a negative result of mobility, instead of understanding that no one here talks about seconds or minutes in saving travel time. We're talking about health, climate, and equity. That is why mobility is described in another way. And I think it's important for us that have sort of lived almost 100 years under one type of regime to understand what this is. Not because it's going to change overnight. That's not what it's all about. And it has started to change earlier, as many of you would know. But here it becomes so obvious that sort of there needs to be a new way of describing what we mean by mobility, by transport policy, and the way we sort of make our, investments or whatever it might be out there. I think you have sort of know about this from climate issues, but we are on the same level. And that's the big news. It's the big news because it offers us a lot of new opportunities and mechanisms. But of course, it's also demanding because we need to understand a new language. It's not that people from climate, health, and equity will come and knock on our doors because they don't really know that we exist in this family. It's us that needs to open our door and learn other people's language and try to understand what they've done and what kind of instruments they are using. So sustainable practices and reporting is one such key word. And of course, I mean, 1.5 years ago or 2 years ago, I didn't have any clue about what was sustainability reporting. And that's something I will come back to a little bit later. It's understanding that things like public procurement is a huge part of the world economy that really hasn't been terribly much used for, well, to some extent for climate, but not for health and equity, maybe a little bit, but not for road safety, I must say. But here is a fantastic opportunity. It is also to see public and private organizations in partnership. And if someone of you is sort of afraid of this kind of phrasing, and what it means is sort of you can't rule the public and the sort of politics side of the world cannot completely rule the private world. Simply everyone has to wake up and do its own role. But to do it in partnership with the same, which means same methods and understanding each other, and of course with the deepest respect, but it puts a lot of, I should say, accountability on every organization, and it's very much linked to organization now. And it asks for participation of all organizations, simply because, for example, there's no business in a dead world, which is important to understand when you talk about private organizations. But for public organizations, understanding that sort of sometimes political decisions are very hard to take, and someone has to do something in advance. And to, for example, like we have done so many times in our area, to blame that things haven't happened because there is no regulation, that doesn't hold any longer. Fortunately, I must say. I think it's been a big hurdle for us. But this means that reading the sort of global goals, the 2030 agenda, is not by looking at goal 3.6, which is address to traffic safety. It's reading all the other ones that will open your eyes. And in particular, 12.6, 12.7 that talks about responsible consumption and production. And 8.8 and 8.6 that talks about sort of safe ways, safe workplaces. There is where you will find the new tools, and they are around. There are more of them, of course. I just mentioned a couple of them that are really important. That's where we as a community, as road safety professionals should look, rather than just continue to stare at our own. And this is really important because, as I said, we are, and we don't have to be sort of ashamed of that or shy or something like that. We are at the same level as the other one. We are a part of health, climate, and equity. And but we need to tell the rest of the world that we are, as I said. And I have to say that, you know, it's traffic safety is about, and this has been really very much sort of pronounced and explained. You can find it in the UN resolution, you can find it everywhere. It's the safe system principles that are sort of the ones that we are coming to the table with. And you know, of course, everything about them. But one of the things is, for example, safety cannot be traded off the benefits of the road transport system. That's spelled out everywhere. And we should be very careful now about making sure that these kind of principles are the ones that really are used in sort of when we explain things, when we want things to be done, and where we start doing things really under the umbrella of 2030 agenda. These are the ones that we're coming to the table with. But what's interesting is that sort of traffic safety, and when we talk about the recommendations we're giving, they are always sort of double, they are double or triple or even more. They are directed to traffic safety, but they are also directed to other qualities of life. So that when we talk about, in this case, this is one of the recommendations about modal shift. Modal shift is important because it makes cities more, not only more livable, but being designed more for active mobility, which is good for air quality, which is good for health and other things. So traffic safety is just one of the qualities for the necessary modal shift. On the other hand, improving traffic safety is a precursor for modal shift. You can't make good modal shift if you don't have safety with you. And this is how sort of every one of the recommendations are sort of described in that way. And it's simply, we're going back again. We are in the family of health, climate, and equity. Therefore, our recommendations are based on supporting, but also get the support for the kind of change we must do. Which means, of course, that city planning or urban safety and things like that has another kind of, let's say, background today, and it's very much helped by these kinds of expressions. And when it starts to really get sort of serious is that when we understand, for example, that the health of our children is based on that you exercise when you are a child. You can never repair not having been sort of physically active as a child. You can never repair that later in life, is what research tells us. So if we don't allow children to move to their activities, to school and things like that, it will have an impact on their health. And if we can't make sure you can do it from young age without risking your life, no parent in the world and no one else would dare to send their children to school in a traffic environment that is risky to them. And you all know we're killing tens of thousands of children every year on the basis of poor design, but there's no excuse, as you know, any longer. And we're not really talking about sort of money here. We're talking about understanding how we do things. It's about changing the status of children's health and children's well-being. And that is why one of the recommendations is so clear that it says, in order to protect the life, security, and well-being of children and ensure the education and sustainability of future generations, therefore, and so on. We all know as professionals, yes, we have so many solutions. We have some that cost very little, we have some that cost extraordinarily a lot of money, but we have solutions here. It's just now that we got so much sort of backup in the way of thinking. We're not coming sort of alone, or we're not saying you should transport every child to school with a car, because that's simply not a terribly good idea from other points of view than safety. But I think such more strong argument and things like this has been taken to the Stockholm Declaration, to the UN resolution as well, and the global plan and so on. There's so much support for this kind of thinking. Actually, I'm quite surprised. WHO seems to simply love this kind of expressions because it brings things together. It's the same thing when we're talking about, and I think this is a little bit revolutionary. That's where I felt like an activist almost. Maybe a little bit too old to be a true activist, but anyway, I think this is the first time that the speed limit has gone all the way up to the UN. Because they sort of, the UN resolutions say that they support what has been said in the Stockholm Declaration. And this is actually what is said. 30 kilometers per hour is the maximum speed, unless you can prove that you can drive faster in a city where you have, or in a setting where you mix different road uses, unprotected and protected road uses. But it says it's because of livable cities' health and security. And once again, for children being able to walk to school and things like that. And I wouldn't be surprised if not UNEC and things like that would actually adopt this for the first time ever to say, you know, this is the kind of speed limit we should apply. And then, of course, make sure that we use it in a clever way, of course. I think you all remember this kind. It's a little bit softer out there. And I move over to sort of the next item. Now I think you all understand sort of the kind of power that's built into these kind of expressions. But one thing that I said in a little bit earlier was that we need to see, especially large corporations, multinational corporations, as cultures that we're pretty sure doesn't like the idea of that within their entire value chain that people are killed, and especially if you talk about children, to assign it to someone's supply chain and value chain, like you have done with child labor or with carbon footprints and things like that. That's why one of the absolutely most powerful things that sort of is in the recommendations and went all the way through to the UN resolution and the global plan is about every corporation's sustainable practices and reporting. And just let me explain, because this has nothing to do with if you trust the private sector or not. This is about what the financial sector wish to invest their enormous lot of money into, and like, retirement funds or life insurance funds or other types of insurance funds that have a massive amount of money, of course, and all the others that are dealing with the capital, the world's capital, including states, of course. Where do they wish to invest their money to have some kind of return of investment? Well, surely those where the business risk is low, that are likely to survive now the next years in terms of minimizing carbon footprint, minimizing poor working conditions, and a few other things that I won't mention here now. But that's the mechanism very much behind why they invest more and why sustainable reporting has become such an important issue. Every large corporation, in most of the cases, must, but at least they do, they report on their carbon footprint, their plans, their targets, what's going on, and also on human rights and on child labor and things like that. I've never read a sustainable report before 2 years ago, but I think I've read 500 since then, and it's very important. And I'm not saying that it is the most exciting type of literature in the world, but it learns a lot about where the world is going. Now we are a part of that. And this is really a big thing, because it means that large corporations are, not saying obliged in the beginning, but will be stimulated, and the sort of big investors will start asking for that traffic safety and the safety footprint must be reported in the sustainable reporting, like you do with, as I said, equity and human rights, with climate, and with the occupational health and safety, which, by the way, occupational health and safety and road crashes and so on has something to do with each other. But these kinds of reporting mechanisms, they are very structured. And they talk about, for example, you take equity and human rights and also occupational health and safety, they state that you must follow rules and regulation. As a corporation, you need to do that, which is quite fascinating when we talk about using the road transport system within your supply chains, which says you can't be speeding or having drivers not fit for drive and things like that. That's an issue for the corporation, not for the driver, but for the corporation to make sure that you are not sort of violating any of the rules and regulations we have sort of where the transport is taking place. But also consistency with science and things like that. So this is a fantastic field, and it's being developed very quickly now across the world, and will be used, as I said, for reporting. Every large corporation will have to report on this and what they're doing, but it will then have an impact, of course, on things like procurement. As I said, 15-20% in Sweden, for example, 20% of the economy is public procurement. And as you know, a lot of things related to transport happens within the umbrella of procurement, which means like public transport and things like that, but also a lot of other things. Every sort of type of movement of goods or people is included in that kind of procurement. And here it says, this is one of the recommendations, that it must be sort of, including the specification of safety in the procurement. And someone says this is a legal problem. Well, I've been assured it is not. But it relates to fleet vehicles, transport services. I mean, you all probably know that the most stupid vehicle we have in our world is a bus, simply because it has no technology whatsoever to support the driver to make sure that they won't hit a pedestrian or a bicyclist or something like that. although they are primarily traveling within the urban settings, which is sort of so strange because we're talking about procurement from the public sector of that kind of operations and vehicles and things. Because you can simply always blame the driver, of course. That's why we probably have such strange regime here. But it will have an impact also on the kind of vehicles we're using across the globe. I'm sure you know that sort of the standards across the globe vary a lot, and everyone sort of, blame regulation, but the cars are actually both produced by large organizations that still dare to produce vehicles with different standards. And also sort of we have major corporations buying vehicles. I think you can calculate that 5 large corporations buy almost together 10% of the world production of cars. Of course, they have an enormous power, but they haven't used it. This is sort of now the first time where you probably will see that happen, but also for trucks and buses and things like that. One thing that also, and I think this is when it really starts to get really fun, is that zero speeding is one of the recommendations and went all the way through. And it's very much directed to fleets and to what large corporations are doing. And it's not about the drivers, it's making sure that there are no tolerances. I mean, I guess all of you know sort of the importance of just 2, 3, 4 kilometers per hour, too much, sort of say, when things go wrong, to understand what kind of impact this will have. But it will have an impact also on the way we look at speed, on the way we make sure of monitoring and controlling and quality assurance and things like that. So just then sort of to repeat a few words to say that I've used now. Remember the word safety footprint. It's nothing strange, but I think that's going to be one of the really buzzwords, because you're asking for a safety footprint within an organization, but it's the whole value chain. It is from, if you take a company that produces something, it's from the raw materials to the end user. That is the entire value chain, and that is used all the time. So it's not only sort of some of the transports, it's really everything related to running on rubber wheels. And you can understand that, there are companies in the world that are bigger than in the economy than many states, which means they have an enormous value or supply chain. And of course, their safety footprint is very big. And that is the reason for why they will start working with it. And the footprint, and I won't go deeper here now, but can sort of divided into employed, contracted, and third parties. And of course, there will be a result from using these kinds of things. And of course, establish and assign a safety footprint to every large organization. And I mean both private and public organization will put road safety at the highest level of priorities, along with health, climate, and equity. This is what I'm saying. And I'm always saying things 2-3 years too early. But mind you, this is when it's going to happen. And it's pretty clear in the global plan that's just been released by WHO and partners that this is going to be the big thing. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing and over to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Claes, and applause indeed from many people already for the presentation. And the least we can say is that you really well respected the time limit, so there is time left for some questions and answers. But maybe I go over to Alexei to moderate that.
Yeah, so we do have some questions in the chat, and the first one is actually from Stein. I can see who wrote them. So again, to clarify, safety cannot be traded off. Does it mean that we should abandon cost-benefit analysis?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I mean, of course, it's important to choose the best option in terms of what it overall can give us. But the trade-off between travel time and safety, that time is definitely over. You can't really, you can't really sort of, with some kind of legitimacy, say that that kind of trade-offs work any longer. But otherwise, of course, I mean, it's so important and becomes even more important, I think, to develop models where you bring in things like carbon or I mean, climate, health, climate, and equity. And to sort of be able to deal with such a complicated things as equity. I mean, that's not simple to, I mean, first of all, define it, but earlier than that, to understand what we really mean by it. And I think this kind of, as you say, revealed kind of values we put on things, I hopefully that time is over. We start, and I think, Claes, you helped me a lot to think about what is acceptable risk, how do we deal with things like that in models that still we need to use, of course, to pick sort of the best possible options. I don't think that explains. I mean, I've always been a little bit, or probably overcritical in this area. That's why I have my biggest enemies in that area. But that was never my intention. It's just that sort of, I think you need to understand and read what is going on now in terms of the highest level of understanding how we go about sharing the resources we have in the community. That was a long answer, but I think we needed a long answer on that question.
Okay, thank you. Now a couple of questions from Katja Kircher. So the first one is about speed, 30 kilometers per hour. Is it really the safe speed, or actually like there is some evidence that it should be even lower?
No, I think it's maximum. I think it is zero speeding. And I think, of course, that no, you need to sort of cater for that. There are other situations as well. I mean, we're just now talking about sort of what do you need to have, what kind of speeds would an more automated vehicle choose? If you apply geofencing, which is going to be, I mean, it's already popular, at least for micromobility, but if you apply it, and it will, of course, be applied by cities, then it's going to be more sensitive. But then I think sort of it's going to be more about accessibility, and for the first time, we maybe need to talk about security, the way we feel about it. Like sending an 8-year-old kid to school. What do we really would like to know about speed before we are, as parents or as a society, willing to send them off to school by their own? Then it's not going to be enough to say, we can always hit them by a few kilometers per hour. That won't hurt them. But I don't think that's enough to say that. It goes beyond safety here, which means safety is death and serious injury. It goes beyond that. So 30 is absolute maximum. You have the reasons, but I think you have to adapt it to different kinds of situations we have out there, especially in terms of automated vehicles. It's a very, very good question, Katja, by the way. I didn't know you were there. Good you raised it.
Yep. And the second question from Katja about zero fatalities. Are we talking about fatalities as a result of crashes, or we should also include deaths due to pollution, noise, lack of physical activity, and so on?
Well, I like to read sort of the words and try to operate on the basis of decisions. And I can't read anything else than you can't do trade-offs. I mean, if you don't have the methods, that's another thing. But you're not allowed as a society to make trade-offs above sort of people's their health and their equity. And I think that's going to be a really big challenge for us to say, no, time savings doesn't allow us to make those kinds of trade-offs any longer. Then it's always a matter of, it's going to take time before you can talk about clean air or no particles or whatever it might be. But that's another issue. I think it's more like you are asking for innovation by saying, we don't allow that to happen if we have the solutions around and we can sort of use them in a way that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now I see a couple of questions from Mosen. So the first one is about differences between rich countries and middle and low income countries. The biggest burden of injuries, fatalities are coming from those countries with poor economy. And for them, the goal which is set for 2030, half the fatality, it might be quite unfeasible. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, thank you, Morten. It's a terrific question. First of all, I'm always felt sort of quite embarrassed coming from a rich country and know the answers and pretending we know the answers of everything. But this time I'm really proud that the recommendations that were given more is directed actually to what's going on in low and middle income country, where you got almost 90% of the fatalities and things like that. Simply because that's where the large corporations' value chain starts. That's where a lot of those kinds of transport, use of different kinds of vehicles, the way cities and other things are operated. So that's simply the reason why this is such an important thing, is to say, I mean, today, if you say, let's just pick a company like IKEA. Can they defend that you're using child labor because they are doing a lot of their furniture in low and middle income countries? The answer is no way. Or can you say, you can always defend that we're killing some children in traffic in those countries simply because otherwise we can't make a profit? Well, the answer is absolutely not. But the children are killed by, and others are killed more or less always by a vehicle moving. Of course, it's not because, they're sitting as a car occupant and not using this child seats or something like that. It is really as unprotected or vulnerable road users. That's where you are hit by other kinds of vehicles. And it doesn't matter if you're in a value chain for some kind of operation where you're transporting goods of different kinds, or mind you, a safety footprint needs to be assigned by the power two-wheeler manufacturers, by the OEMs, by the car manufacturers, and particularly those who are building the trucks and buses. They can't either defend any longer that their safety footprint is something they don't care about. And of course, the majority of them comes from the low and middle income countries. That's why this makes sense more than ever. And for the first time, I can be a little bit proud of saying that even if you're a stupid guy coming from a very rich country, you still have something for those that really needs it most. And I mean it.
Yeah, I think here it would fit very well the question from Christer about again, industry. So it has been quite amazing that industry produced lots of innovations when it comes to climate issues, like steel production, for example. They improved technology greatly, and so on and so on. So do you have any examples when it comes to safety from the industry side?
Almost like I paid every $100 to get the good questions. So thanks very much also for this question, and Krista. It's a good one. No, and I think, and I, of course, we all understand that why corporations are dealing with their carbon footprint to the extent that they are doing, meaning that you are doing enormous investments. I mean, you can look at OEMs, the car industry, what is doing in terms of electrification, or what steel industry is doing also in terms of the carbon footprint, is simply because the eyes are on, but it is the investors that run the world, as you know. It is not so strange from their perspective that Tesla is more worth than GM and Ford and others together, that it's the highest value in the car industry of them all. If you think about who they think will survive, if you talk about the next 10 years. Now, I know there are other reasons as well, but at least to say, you know, this is a reason. But you don't value those who doesn't seem to be very much on track, that you don't value them as high. Now, if we can do the same thing with our field in traffic safety, of course, you will get the same process. It wouldn't be surprising at all. But then we need, as professionals, and you're all professionals, we need really to understand and to use these kind of instruments and mechanisms in the community. And once and for all, stop dividing the world in those who we trust and those who we don't trust. Make sure the mechanisms are there. That's the one we can trust or not trust. And if we trust that, if we can make sure that big corporations will report on the safety footprint, you can bet that they will start innovate things also for the low and middle income countries, because that's where you got your big safety footprints. It's going to be more complicated for those countries that have a very low safety footprint, like Sweden, where innovations might not be as attractive as they are in some countries where you got a huge safety footprint. But that's another story.
Now it's really the discussion starts in the chat, so I have a bit troubles of following. A comment, yeah.
Sorry, I don't follow that, but maybe I should.
No. It's too much text to process.
Okay.
That's what I'm complaining about. I see a comment here from Brazil also, that the burden in countries like Brazil of traffic fatalities, injuries is very high. And basically the comment is that now we're discussing here good table manners while some big part of the world has nothing to eat. But I think partly you have already answered how it relates to low and middle income countries. It's still relevant.
Yeah, but I think, and once and for all, let's make sure that we really cooperate on these kinds of issues. Sometimes the owner of the big supply chain, they could be in some tax paradise or something, but most of them would be, I mean, like in the US or in Europe, maybe sometimes in the really rich countries. But the production and everything else happens in other parts of the world. That's why I'm saying value chains are borderless. You don't have to look at the community in the same way as you do when you're talking about normal like countries and other types of sort of jurisdictions. That is why this might have a really impact. Now, I'm not saying that this is everything. Just let me assure it's not everything. But it might be one of the really big game changers out there. Then there are other things that we need to think about, equity and about things like green or yellow bonds and things like that, how the World Bank and others behave out there in the world. But also we can put pressure on governments with some kind more of legitimacy than what we have been able to do before. Because the UN Declaration, our resolution is so clear. And in all countries except one has sort of, I think it's two, has sort of, let's say, signed it, if you may call it. Thanks.
Okay, maybe we can just let in people raise hands. Yeah. So yeah, if you want to ask a question, just raise a hand and we will let you in. Yes, Thomas. Yes, can you please unmute yourself? Unmute yourself, we don't hear you.
Okay, I'm calling from India. I spent some 10 years in Europe, including about 8-9 years in Sweden. I was there until 1994, until Sweden has completed its resolving birth position. That is, any home you are born, you are treated equal since the World War II. So now, 25 years you leave that for transfer, and now we are starting from 2020. So in at least 2 generations, say by 2070, can we say Vision Zero is a part of SDG and or any global plan? And secondly, is Sweden like countries which has completed already, and also many European countries which are made to be rich with purpose, are they ready to start the death position resolution? That is, the value of life is same, whether they are getting killed in accidents in road or in plane or in climate or whatever. So because that will also affect the value of time, and also it will affect the value of salaries and job generation and so on. So is Sweden ready for resolving death position in a risk society perspective? These are the 2 questions. I don't know. Claes, I also don't know much about him, but if he's familiar, he can answer, or anyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe someone else wished to answer that question. I honestly think sort of that once again, value of life is of course equal across the world. I don't think that anyone else of us has any other view on that. It's just that the models we have been using in our field doesn't really pick up that in a way that is at least understandable for me. It's not. And but I get confused when you start talking about travel times and things like that. Personally, I've never understood why anyone will give another person the right to play with fundamental issues in life. You can't do that if you talk about workplace safety. You can't do that when you talk about a lot of other things in the community. There is sort of there's even a legal barrier in most parts of the world in sort of interchanging benefits to disbenefits when you're not talking about the same person, because there's no way to sort of pay the ones that you are stealing someone from, if I may be really put it very blunt here. That's why I really don't understand, Thomas, if I completely miss something, but maybe someone else wished to sort of go deeper into that issue. I'm trying just to explain what it seems to be going on. That's my sort of simple answer. Sorry for that.
Okay, Per.
Okay, so Claes, you talked about safety print or in low and middle income countries, and certainly in the United States too, we have a lot of safety issues. And I think with respect to speed, the US used to be the model country. When traveling to the US in the 1980s from Europe, we were impressed by how slow Americans were driving. on interstates and in cities too. And that is all deteriorating. There's a few states, North Carolina is one of them, that has passed Vision Zero. They did that in 2016 when they had roughly 1,300 fatalities, the same as Sweden had at its peak. North Carolina has just over 10 million people, so it's very comparable to Sweden. But since they passed Vision Zero, the number of fatalities have crept up. And it was over 1,600 in 2020. Because of the pandemic, people drove less and therefore with higher speeds. And is a state like North Carolina ruining the Vision Zero, data-driven Vision Zero idea around the world when you pass legislation or set up goals and then you don't do anything? Thank you.
Yeah. I guess, of course, it's not an intention from everyone. I mean, as you know, Per, it's a very good question. It's not made clear everywhere how you sort of subdivide. What is the role of politics? What's the role of professionals in this area? I mean, you do it in medicine, in engineering. You wouldn't be talking about, it's not a political decision how to build a bridge or how to operate somewhere in your body or something like that. And I think we're mature enough to say, you know, what belongs to what. In our area, we still run the sort of professional part with a lot of amateurism. We believe it's sort of that we can vote on Newton's law in the parliament, if it exists or not, while in reality we should leave that to the expert community. I mean, it's up to of course, to the democracy to decide what kind of mobility we should allow ourselves, like we do when we talk about aviation or rail or something like that. But you leave over to the professional community to make sure that people sort of survive when we're using it. And that subdivision has been very successful in some areas, as you know, then with aviation and so on. But it's a mess in the road transport system, complete mess, as you know, where politicians or even individual road users sort of, you know, common sense and things like that rule over science. I think that's messy. I think that parliaments should be able to get that kind of things right. So they leave what they should leave over and what they not should leave over. The most fundamental thing, and that was what I was striving from day one at the Swedish Transport or Road Administration, was to say, safety owns speed. We don't need to own anything else because it can control more or less the level of kinetic energy with speed. So a certain kind of solution will lead to a certain speed, another solution will lead to another. So if the society needs high speed, you need a lot of money to invest, and therefore it becomes a mobility investment rather than a safety investment. That's the principle underlying that when I said Vision Zero principles or safe system principles, and I think we should stay with that. So telling the sort of political level, no, we as professionals own speed. You put up what you desire. We tell you what it's going to cost, but we own speed. That's my answer in simple. But it's a very good question, Pat. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Claes, for that answer. I think this really summarizes a lot. We are coming at the end of the webinar. I see that Christer raised his hand, so I would like to make an exception for him to ask the final question of the day or to give the final comment of the day. Please, up to you, Christer.
The final comment is simply that I personally have been extremely agitated by this presentation, and I thank Claes very much for that. That is the least. And then I want to raise a question that has to do with the former and also the present version of ICTCT, namely surrogate measures and things like that. Because talking about cities and city life and, every quality aspect on cities, that we need more than fatal accidents and serious accidents. We need cooperation between people and so on, and we haven't operationalized that. So I think there is still a lot of use for knowledge linked to the original ICTCT concept, namely conflicts and near accidents and things like that. But primarily, I'm extremely happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Christer. These are thankful words. And maybe a last comment from Claes about the surrogate safety measures.
I was just so happy and to see Christer. I've been so much supported by Christer over the years, sitting there in the bureaucracy and having someone who dare to say how things really are, and that's what Christer and others, of course, helped me with. I agree totally what you're saying, and I think it becomes more important to dare. And I know it's forbidden to say that safety has got something with security to do, the feeling of safety and how you dare to send your kids to school. But I think we need those kinds of measurements more today when we're talking about more qualities than just not getting killed. I think that plays a role also when you talk about surrogate measurements. Yeah, it makes sense. Thanks a lot. And good to see you once again, Christer.
The same.
Okay, thanks a lot. Listening to these nice words, we will close the session. It was very nice to have you all in the session, to have Claes in the session, to have so many friends and colleagues around the world in the session, well-known faces, new faces, people who have been around for a long time, people who are quite new to the field. Thanks a lot for being here, and very welcome to join us at one or another occasion. Thanks a lot and enjoy the weekend.